Okay, so thank you very much, Philip. And as you said, it's going to be a double act. And in this particular presentation, I'm going to focus more on the technical aspects, and Sihai is going to focus more on the science, particularly the one that is relevant for green growth, clean growth. Okay, so this presentation was largely put together by the WISH team, Fabio Orlandi, Dimitri Kaliavin, and Pascal Manuel. A lot of work has gone on with the engineers and also to do polarization tests on llama, and here are the people that are being acknowledged. Apparently there's no way, there wasn't any photo taken from the front of Andrea and Goran. And I'm Paolo Radaelli from the University of Oxford. So I want to take you back circa the beginning of 2003 or 4, when WISH was designed and first of all conceived. And these two people that I'm showing here are Ken Anderson, who was then instrument responsible for OSIRIS, and Laurent Chapon, who was instrument responsible for GEM. At that time, I was head of crystallography. And we've been looking at OSIRIS in the diffraction mode. Today, we heard about OSIRIS in the spectroscopy mode. But of course, OSIRIS had a diffraction mode. And in particular, these data that were collected by Paul Attfield and collaborators on a rather complicated structure. And they presented in their paper, quoted here, 2 data sets, one collected on D20, which I flipped around so that it looks like time of flight. Of course, it's 2 theta mode, and the other one on OSIRIS here on the top. Now, quite apart from the fact that the D20 data is low temperature, so there are magnetic peaks, you could quite easily tell the difference in resolution of these 2 instruments. And D20 was and is considered a very powerful medium resolution diffractometer. But OSIRIS, particularly at these short time of flight, but also the longer time of flight, as you can see from the box that illustrates the same magnetic peaks, has a much better resolution. And then, of course, if you go even further to the left, you see a complete resolution of the pattern, whereas on D20, it's basically just oscillations. So we started thinking about this, but when things really started to become clear is when I look at my own data I collected on manganites on GEM, here, the three patterns on the top, and on OSIRIS on the bottom. And this is really quite striking illustration of the potential of these longer wavelength diffractometer. This is when, like John Belushi in the Blues Brothers, I saw the light. And this is when we started really thinking about a long wavelength, broad bandwidth diffractometer for target station 2. So what is WISH stands for wide angle in a single histogram. And we were thinking primarily at magnetism, and the intuition was contrary to what most people were thinking, actually, is that we needed good resolution to solve magnetic structures, especially incommensurate complex magnetic structures. So we can't just do low angles. And the pattern I showed before is a clear illustration. This is not even that complex magnetic structure, but they are clearly much better resolution in the kind of 7-8 angstroms range. But also you need short wavelength newtons to correlate with the structure. So we need a wide bandwidth, a wide range of wavelengths. Also, we were obsessed by low background to do small moment or small samples and good collimation, again, to reduce the background further, which is best done at 90 degrees, whereas the best resolution, of course, is in backscattering. This would also optimize coverage with respect to sample environment. Finally, we had the ambition to do single crystals as well as powders. So we designed these very complex engineering pieces of engineering, the detectors of which have practically no gap and have these complex systems to bring them together with basically kissing each other. So we were thinking, as I said, about magnetism, but then people like Bill David pointed out that such an instrument would be excellent also to do other things, such as large unit cells, especially host-get systems, and I'll come back to it, ultra-small samples, very absorbing samples, etc. So I want to point out one thing, that WISH exploits the unique advantages of the short pulse spallation sources. This is extremely difficult to emulate IDSS, for example. Okay, so instruments like WISH will remain competitive for the foreseeable future, regardless of what they can do at ESS. So they will have other advantages and other instruments at ESS, but this type of broad bandwidth diffractometer is not doable at ESS. So WISH has an amazing success and it widens its science portfolio much beyond what we were hoping, to a variety of functional materials, both in the domain of quantum materials and in the domain of functional materials proper, that is, materials for energies, materials for catalysis, in a wide domain of ranges. Everything that was tried essentially worked. We wonder whether we could do thin films, which is very hard to do on diffraction, neutron diffraction, but this worked amazingly well. We are going to try free-floating membranes of few nanometer thickness. You know, everything worked, but yet there are things we've not done on WISH that were foreseen at the beginning, such as polarization. So we had a essentially station to introduce a polarizer, which was not done. It's nevertheless an amazing success story, very large subscription rate. It has 10% of all ISIS beamtime publications. And interestingly, there is a large fraction of the program that is single crystal, and it occupies a disproportional amount of beamtime, of course, because these experiments are quite slow. Not because the instrument doesn't have enough flux, but because it has relatively low reciprocal space coverage, being essentially an equatorial plane diffractometer. So looking at this success, looking at the oversubscription, it's a natural idea to say, okay, let's build another instrument like that. Okay, so you know, let's try and create more capacity, but also trying to optimize instruments for different things. And this is the idea of the new WISH. Okay, so this is also an instrument to be on TS2, but somewhat different design, which is shown here on the right. So it's no longer an equatorial plane diffractometer, but it is a more or less, you know, almost all the sphere diffractometer typical of single crystal machines. It's also a much more compact detector, which means also a cheaper detector, given the coverage that we want to achieve. And therefore, the two instruments will have similar primary flight path. That is what provides the excellent resolution and great bandwidth of WISH, will be replicated on WISH 2. It has a shorter secondary flight path, but essentially the same resolution using a next generation detectors based on wavelength shifting fibers. WISH 2 will have a much wider detector coverage and a wider detector 2 theta range as well, to go towards some elements of small angle scattering as well. Conversely, on WISH 1, we will introduce the polarization options that we wanted to have from the beginning, and more on this in a second. For both WISH 1 and WISH 2, we are planning a moderator upgrade, which essentially provide a much sharper function, which is very important for many applications, such as, for example, epitaxial films, where you really need to resolve the film from the substrate at essentially no cost in peak flux. So that's the idea. The two instruments will do complementary things. WISH 2 optimized for small samples, single crystals, larger sample environment, more bulky sample environment, excellent collimation, and WISH 1 more focus on magnetism and certain applications, also in functional materials. So to conclude my part, I want to focus on two aspects that are particularly important for this community, that is the community looking at clean growth. So next week or in 2 weeks, I'm going to talk more about the magnetism aspects. Okay, so but before I do that, I just show this comprehensive slide to show all the tests that the WISH team did, both on the hardware and on the simulation. And I'll just want to show one thing, say one thing about this, that WISH 2 is really a mature instrument in which a lot of work has been going on. And also the polarization has been extensively tested on Llama to demonstrate that it is possible to do to build these devices to achieve XYZ polarization, and more in a second. Okay, so let me go to two particular science/technical aspects that are of interest for this community, and let Sihai talk about the science. Okay, first is the host guest systems or guest host systems. And I want to explain why WISH 2 is ideal for these. So what do you need to do to have for these systems? Well, you need some kind of system to load, to gas load the system, often at moderate pressures. you need to do in situ diffraction, and you need to monitor changes in the diffraction patterns that mostly occur at low angle, okay? And so these particular data were collected on a full array NaLi5 C60 fulleride with hydrogen deuterium loading, and the data are unpublished by Garibaldi and et al. And this is actually zooming in the diffraction pattern. You can see the effect of the guest species is essentially all at these very long despacing. And this is clear because these are relatively disordered species in the lattice, and so they drop off in intensity much faster, whereas the host is essentially unchanged, and you here see the host peak being on the left of the pattern. So we could do these experiments on WISH. These experiments were done on WISH 1, but we could do them better on WISH 2, given the wider detector coverage in 90 degrees, and also the possibility of introducing collimation that is tailor-made for these particular experiments. So having a variety of collimators and devices is one feature that will be typical of WISH 2. Okay, so more on this later on the science. In other words, on polarization option, as I said, this was foreseen from the beginning and will enable new science to be done on WISH 1. Clearly, polarization is mostly used to separate the magnetic component from the structural component, particularly in powders, and also to look at magnetostructural interference, particularly in single crystals. So this slide illustrates how you can separate the magnetic diffuse scattering here on the right from the coherent structural scattering here on the left, and the experiment is from D7, classic experiments done on this instrument, and they rely on measuring separately the intensity of non-spin flip here on the top and spin flip here on the bottom in different directions. And to do that, you need a device that guides the polarized neutrons with a particular orientation of the samples and then guides them back to the detector. More importantly from this community is the possibility to separate coherent from incoherent, spin incoherent scattering in hydrogenated samples. So as you could see from the previous slide here, in the non-spin flip channel, which is the top channel, there is only 1/3 of the spin incoherent. So you suppress 2/3 of your hydrogenous background, which is extremely important in itself for some of these experiments, and in many cases will avoid the need for deuteration. So this is the first benefit of having polarized neutrons with polarization analysis. And then you can separate extremely well the three components. So the magnetic components, so there is one, and here I'm looking at the panel on the top left. Magnetic component, in this case, there wasn't any. The nuclear coherent component here in gray, and the spin incoherent, that is the hydrogenous background in red. And you can, using this technique, you can precisely titrate the amount of the hydrogen in the sample, because you know that this signal comes entirely in hydrogen-containing samples, comes entirely from hydrogen. Okay, so these experiments will provide new opportunities for experiments in the domain of functional materials, particularly to do with proton conductors. I'll stop here and let Sihai talk about the science opportunities. I have a lot more slides which I can discuss in the breakout session later on. Thank you.
Okay, let me start to share my screen. Can you all see it? I only have a couple of slides, and I'll be quick. So just to illustrate the science capacity at the WISH, and also the future possibility that could be achieved on WISH 2, of course. And we have had some very extensive introduction in terms of climate change, environmental problems, and the importance of clean growth, of course. So I'm not going to go into details of this. I listed a couple of areas that how WISH science could contribute to the resolution of climate change. So as mentioned by Paolo, so the majority of the study currently on WISH is on magnetism. But clearly, there's also a very successful program on the studies of large host gas systems, in particular MOFs and zeolites, done by our group and colleagues in the UK and the EU as well. So the whole idea started in 2014, where I illustrate this example in here. That is a MOF system with a relatively large unit cell. That is about 3,000 angstrom cubic. So we did a combination of elastic neutron scattering, quasi-elastic neutron scattering, and the neutron diffraction to resolve the host gas interaction that rationalize the separation properties. And today, this becomes to be a really very successful program indeed. So if we look at the capture of carbon dioxide, so in the porous MOF, in terms of functionalization with a nitro group, where we visualize the interaction between the CO2 and the interior of MOF, particularly the functional group, and also the redox active metal site in the MOF material, how they contribute to the strong absorption of CO2. And of course, on the zeolite, we dope metal ion into the zeolites and then look at the binding of between acetylene and the CO2. So clearly, neutron diffraction and scattering played quite an important role in terms of distinguishing between the acetylene and the CO2 molecules. Ammonia storage is another very important area of research, as previously mentioned by colleagues. So this is treated as a green source of hydrogen. So really a very multi-billion pound business in the future. So it's between our group and a group in Oxford, colleagues in Oxford. So we developed a range of MOF system that can achieve reversible high capacity storage of ammonia to aid their transport, long distance or short distance transports. In particular, such systems in here, published in here, they have a massive unit cell that could be a 10,000 angstrom cubic. So this Wish diffractometer really playing an important role in there. And another recent example is on the study of separations of purification of lower olefins, which clearly is very important in terms of manufacture of many materials we use today, from homemade to cars. And the traditional way of purification is via hydrogenation over noble metal catalyst, which is clearly energy intensive, and it has a poor selectivity. So what we have done in here is develop a new zeolite material that can do the molecular sieving to remove the impurities, and therefore to have a pure lower olefins. And this is the Wish study we have done to visualize the binding mechanism between the acetylene on the top and the ethylene in this case, to reveal their difference in their nature. So this is the last slide I have to illustrate the potential application of Wish in terms of sustainable manufacturing. So the example I want to talk about today is the conversion of a biomass into a lower olefins, which is currently mainly produced from cracking of a heavy oil that plays heavy environmental problems. So biomass clearly is a desirable resource. So we developed this new zeolite material with a decorated pore structure, where we revealed reaction mechanism through the niobium and the OH sites to bind and activate biomass-related molecules. So in this case, we didn't use a Wish, but a synchrotron study to work out the position of it due to two problems. One is biomass-related substrate, extremely difficult to deuterate them. And there's, of course, a limited beam time in terms of Wish computation that everyone knows. So with this potential development of polarization analysis with some unprecedented resolution, we hopefully in the future will be able to eliminate the background and allow the locations of hydrogen positions in the more complex molecules in there. So for the interest of time, I think I'll stop in here. Thank you.
Paolo and Sihai, thank you very much indeed for presenting Wish